Hello, Montana, and hello, world. This is Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council, bringing you another episode of Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. This week, we're celebrating the International Day of Peace, which took place on Monday, the 21st. The International Day of Peace is devoted to commemorating and strengthening the ideals of peace among and within people and nations all around the world. We're doing this in partnership with our friends at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Now, the U.S. Institute of Peace is also undertaking the Peace Day Challenge, which exists to raise the profile of the International Day of Peace and to affirm peace as a real alternative to the violence we see every day in our world. It's about inspiring a day of action around September 21st, focused on building peace through real-life activities and sharing on social media. So check them out at hashtag Peace Day Challenge. That's the U.S. Institute of Peace. We're also joined this week by our local partners and good friends at the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center. And the people who make all of this possible are our generous sponsors, with special thanks to Stockman Bank, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, and Allegiance. Thank you once again to our sponsors. Now let me welcome our guest for today. Mr. Dennis McNamara has more than 3 decades of international humanitarian experience, during which he held several senior positions across the United Nations before becoming the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue's Senior Humanitarian Advisor in 2007. Prior to joining the center, Dennis served as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR's, Special Envoy to Iraq and the former Yugoslavia, and as UNHCR Director of International Protection. Dennis has also worked in UN peacekeeping operations and as Director of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. He was Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General in Kosovo, as well as Deputy UN Administrator in Timor-Leste. Prior to this, Dennis headed the human rights component of the UN Transitional Authority in Cambodia. Dennis has an honors degree in law from Auckland University and practiced as a lawyer in the UK and Kenya before joining the United Nations. Dennis, you are very welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chris. Welcome. Glad to be here.
Dennis, I wonder if you could just say a couple words to begin with about broadly humanitarianism and peacemaking and your experience, and maybe the role that the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue plays.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Council for this opportunity. I welcome it. Humanitarianism and peacemaking. Yes, it's a complex equation, but as you said, since I left the UN more than a decade ago, I've been the Senior Humanitarian Advisor with the Humanitarian Dialogue Center in Geneva, which essentially embarked mainly on political dialogues to try and promote conflict resolution from areas varying from Syria to South Sudan to Mali to Myanmar and Papua New Guinea. And my exposure has really been on the humanitarian side of that equation. So when the agenda for those dialogues was a humanitarian one, I was involved. For example, as you and I were both there, we both know I was involved with the Darfur rebels, for example, for 4 years, trying to get a mediation between them unsuccessfully and the government. I also worked with colleagues in the office in talking to the Taliban in Afghanistan on humanitarian issues for a number of years, also with mixed results, of course. And subsequently, I've been particularly focused on the issue of the Rohingya refugees and the dialogue that's necessary between Myanmar and Bangladesh on that subject. These are all complex, vexed questions, but all wrapped in the middle of the politics is always the humanitarian aspect of the equation. I've also, as I mentioned to you, I think briefly, become a pro bono advisor to Legal Action Worldwide, a law group, which is essentially trying to find legal redress and remedies for the victims of conflict, particularly women and girls, victims of sexual violence. So that's another aspect of what we're trying to do at the moment. Should I talk to you a bit about the broad issue of humanitarianism and peace?
Yes, please go right ahead, Dennis.
What I wanted to share with you, Chris, was really three basic issues. And they are some things that I have spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about. And I think they remain valid, even more valid today, probably than previously. The first is that as you probably know, we are facing, I believe, a fundamental challenge to the basic structures and principles of the international, what I would call the international humanitarian protection system. By that I mean international humanitarian law, human rights law, and refugee law in all its dimensions. And the problem of humanitarian crises and populations instability and lack of protection is a problem for peace processes as well. And I'll come back to that. I would suggest that there has been a global, systematic, almost political failure in recent years, more acutely than I've seen in decades, to support the international system and the need for those principles and the framework so painstakingly constructed after World War II in the euphoria of never again, which was the theme of those days, a need to somehow mobilize alternative mechanisms to states in order to address this political vacuum. By that I mean that unless we are able to reinvigorate and support these structures and principles, I believe that the international protection system, as presently constituted, faces a real existential challenge. Currently, we are facing 40-something conflicts worldwide. Most of them are internal, not between states. But in all of them, almost, there has been regular targeting of civilians, and there's been mass forced displacement of population, which has led to a record number in recent decades of refugees and IDPs, some 65 million today globally, which is higher than any time since these mechanisms were established. Most of the 65 million refugees and IDPs today lack any basic physical or legal protection. And unless there is movement on that, I'm afraid it will have huge consequences. Let me give you some figures which are rather numbing, but I think necessary. For example, a snapshot. Syria, one of the worst conflicts, unresolved. 400,000 estimated civilian casualties. 6 million refugees at least. These are best estimates. Darfur, where you and I were both involved, almost a forgotten conflict, but 300,000 casualties and rising, and 2.5 million displaced population. Just South Sudan, 380,000 casualties, 4 million IDPs. Myanmar, thousands, no one knows exactly, of casualties, and 1 million refugees. In Afghanistan, over 100,000 casualties, mainly civilians, and 3 million refugees. These are numbing statistics, but that's the reality, a snapshot of the reality of what we're facing globally today. Most, as usual, most of the casualties of these conflicts, are rooted by these conflicts, are women and children. And sadly, tragically, the UN reports that 1 in 5 refugees and IDPs is estimated to have suffered also sexual abuse. And there are many more unreported cases. The world's current conflicts all include the intentional targeting of civilians, and hence the disproportionate casualty numbers of civilians. And it includes the targeting of humanitarian facilities, such particularly as hospitals and schools. These are war crimes without accountability. These violations of international humanitarian law, as it's called, based on the Geneva Conventions, signed after World War II by all member states, all 196 member states. These violations go without any agreed sanctions. They're honored, the principles of protection in the IHL are honored more in the breach and in the resolution. The UN Security Council has called this a key aspect of dealing with conflicts, but has taken no further action. At the same time as this is continuing in conflict areas, the refugees who are fleeing these areas are not adequately protected in any way, in most situations. And one of the reasons is that the architects of this international protection system post-World War II are themselves regularly in breach of its provisions. I'll give you some examples, brief examples. The EU, the European Union, the heart of Europe, is funding Libya, a corrupt Libyan Coast Guard system, to return both refugees from Libya to what have been called torture centers by the UN in Tripoli. And this continues in order to stop them getting into Europe. Western Europe countries, a number of them are forcibly returning today Afghan teenagers to Kabul, where even NATO troops are not allowed to drive from the airport to the city. US and Australia are detaining asylum seekers, splitting families and relocating many of them to offshore facilities. And the UK is refusing to allow refugee children in Calais to join their relatives in the United Kingdom. As well as that, what we call the safety valve of refugee issues, third country resettlement, which the US has traditionally led, has virtually been turned off by all developed countries. As a result, 80% of the refugees today remain in squalid camps in developing countries underfunded. This massive international displacement is too often seen, in my view, as a sideshow in the conflict resolution process. Sustainable peace cannot be built on the shifting sands of uprooted and unprotected civilian populations. Civilian populations must be protected and supported if peace agreements are really to take root. And if we don't agree with that, we should look at South Sudan, Afghanistan, Darfur, and a number of other examples. Why then has the international system failed, and what can be done about it? I would suggest that some of the obvious. There's been a collective failure by key states to respect the principles and instructions and the structures which they established in that never again euphoria 75 years ago. The UN Security Council is now more deeply divided than it has been in recent decades. And it is notable, I think, that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, USR, Russia, China, France, the UK, have themselves provided 90% of the world's arms to these conflicts. They are the world's arms major suppliers. So the combination of these factors is that any high moral ground which Western states had has been eroded as they are seen to breach the principles that they established, usually under nationalistic and xenophobic local pressures. There's been a lack of international solidarity in this area, as we are seeing in a different way in response to the COVID epidemic. Refugees and foreigners are easy targets politically, and there's been a reduced interest in resolving also remote conflicts. There is a political vacuum as a result, which needs, I would suggest, a renewed solidarity and action by civil society groups and activists generally, as was mobilized, you may remember, in the case of the Landmines Convention and the movement called ICAN for nuclear disarmament, both of which received Nobel Peace Awards as a result. There are also needs, I would suggest, strengthened efforts to use legal remedies and responses both nationally, regionally, and globally to try and reinvigorate and prop up the humanitarian system. As I've seen recently with what is called the Climate Litigation Network, a group of environmental activists who have called it Save the Planet One Lawsuit at a Time. They took a legal action against the government of the Netherlands for failing to reduce carbon emissions, and they prompted new parliamentary action as a direct result. In the UK, another small example, where they hope to deport a Syrian boat refugee back to Spain. The judges ruled not that Spain was dangerous, but that the asylum system there was dysfunctional, and they blocked the deportation. That is an example of where the law can step in when politics fail. What's the role of the US and of Americans in this? Well, it's a crucial one, in my view. The US was one of the principal founders of this international system, with a proud history of positive and leading international action. Think back to the Indo-Chinese refugee exodus, where with a huge involvement of NGOs, both American and international, there were more than 2 million refugees happily resettled in the US and other countries, and eventually the boat exodus from that country was overcome. What to do in Montana? Well, I've just read that you have a very famous Jeanette Rankin Peace Center there, placed with a claim to support the soft landing of refugees in Missoula. Maybe it's a chance for organizations like yours to join up with the others globally to see whether this mobilization that I mentioned could be possible. Thank you very much.
Dennis, thank you very much. I mean, that's absolutely a fascinating overview, and connecting the humanitarian situation with peace building and peacemaking. And Dennis did mention that he and I have actually worked in a couple of places. I've really had the pleasure of working with Dennis in Burma and Uganda and in Sudan. And so, Dennis, let me kind of zero in a little bit on your last point when you're talking about the role of the United States and the role of American citizens and organizations. I wonder if you could just, maybe say a couple words from the outside. You're in your office in Geneva now. You're typically not working here in America, but when the United States is not engaged or not adequately engaged or not engaged in the right places at the right time, what does that look like from the outside, and what effect does that have on the perceptions people have about America?
Yeah, good question. From the outside, I think it's pretty clear that although there are many critics of the US administration around the world today, as you know, nevertheless, in my decades in refugee protection work in particular, but also in peacekeeping to some extent, the US was always one of the foremost positive actors when we needed political support. We would never have got the Indo-Chinese boat refugee problem solved without US leadership. We wouldn't have had the same ability to intervene in Cambodia, for example, without US leadership, or in Kosovo without, or in Timor. So I think that leadership has been crucial. It's generally been positive. Of course, we have our problems. We've had our problems, and I had problems with the US treatment of Haitian boat people. But nevertheless, internationally, the leadership was often there. Europe hasn't got that. The EU is, as I think Kissinger said, what's the phone number? Who do you call? There's no outstanding, notable European leadership in that sense. And although it's a mixed blessing in some ways, it's nevertheless a huge gap in the international response. And I think that's seen very clearly in the countries we deal with. The US, for example, pushed very hard, as you know, for the South Sudan peace agreement. But when South Sudan went to hell again, as it's done recently, there wasn't the same US involvement. There was no embargo on arms sales to South Sudan from the US and the Security Council, for example. So I think that lack of leadership is also seen when we see refugee families split and children separated from their parents and detained and boats pushed off or relocated to offshore facilities by the US, that's a very strong message to the developing countries, where 80% of these people are living under great difficulty. So I think that is a crucial element, and we can only hope that it comes back in the way that it was there.
Dennis, if I can just, take the next question on that one, and I'll remind our viewers that you're free to chat in questions. I am getting some via the chat function to me, or you can chat to everyone. But Dennis, so the next question for Americans is, oftentimes regarding this issue or generally on foreign policy, Americans ask themselves, why should I care about this? How does this actually affect my life? How does the success or failure of a South Sudan peace negotiation affect my life here? Because we have other things going on within our domestic politics and our domestic policy that are, seemingly more immediate. These things seem so far away, but do they have a kind of impact that maybe we're not seeing or we're not feeling?
Yeah, that's a similar question to one we hear often mentioned about the COVID pandemic. The nationalistic response is, so we'll close our borders and we'll close up and we'll develop our vaccines and we'll be fine. It doesn't work like that. In humanity, refugees, migration, etc., doesn't respect borders. They don't respect borders. They impact you wherever you are. South Sudan imploding will lead to instability in the region, which will lead to probably insurgency by groups in the region, where the US has deployed troops in that region to stop such Islamic insurgency, for example. So I think there is a direct relationship, Chris, not only because you're in a country founded on the principles of humanity and equality, and let's face it, it's a migration country. At the highest levels, you have migrants in every strata of society, and for great benefit. And I think that humanity and those principles and that Statue of Liberty are symbolic of that history. So I don't think you can cut off for a short time, but it will have an impact. It'll have an impact where you are eventually, like the virus, and it certainly has a global impact on the standing of the United States in the world.
Thanks for that, Dennis. Let me just shift gears a little bit, and just let our audience know that Dennis is actually practicing peacemaking in a very unique space, where he talks about the nexus or the connection between humanitarian assistance and peacemaking. Now, Dennis, just a kind of conundrum for you. On the side of peacemaking, it's often a political act, and it's within a political sphere whereby political deals are made. Within the humanitarian sphere, humanitarians pride themselves on their independence and neutrality from politics. So in your work, how do you tread that very difficult line between the political side and the humanitarian side?
Well, I think the challenge is not to politicize the humanitarian, not to make it part of a political negotiation. But I think the other side of that, Chris, is that in peacemaking or conflict resolution, you ignore human rights and humanitarian issues at your peril, because they will come back to haunt and probably undermine any peace agreement that's been done, as I mentioned. So I think it's not a politicization of humanitarian human rights issues. It's a proper role for those issues in the compact of peacemaking. Talk to many of the victims of conflicts in peace negotiations. They will talk a lot about justice. And they mean justice for them and their people. And when we've seen those agreements go through without that, and South Sudan would be perhaps one example, traditional grievances, land disputes, tribal conflicts, underlying issues not addressed, just a peace agreement to get the soldiers, the guys to put down their guns, it's not enough. It's not the fertile ground you need to seed lasting peace.
Dennis, that's a great point. And I'll just remind our viewers that yesterday's guest, Dr. Kathleen Keenest from the USIP, was talking exactly about this and the role of women in peace building and peacemaking, and that if everybody is not enfranchised, the likelihood of any peace deal falling apart is much higher. So that's a very interesting point you make.
And
Dennis, we're coming to
I'd
the
say,
end.
Chris, on that, could I
Yeah,
interrupt
please
you?
go ahead.
I would say this is a crucial inclusion has become a catchphrase. But you know, it's not just getting women to sit at the table. It's to actually have them have an influence on the processes. And we are challenged by that. I'll be frank. You try and get, as you know, Darfur rebel women or Taliban women, even Rohingya women at the table, not just as a token, but as real active participants. That's historical, cultural, and real challenge. It's there, and I think sometimes it has to be done separately, but it's a challenge that we must face up to, because absolutely the burden of conflicts falls on the women, and the burden of the peace building falls on the women and the families, for sure.
Well, Dennis, I mean, you'd agree that the challenges are huge and many across a wide spectrum and across so many different situations. Let me say we're coming to the end of our time here, but I would like to go back to you if you have any last words for our audience.
No, I just think when I heard about the sort of history you have in your state and the sort of peace, famous peace initiatives that was taken by your dear lady whose peace center is now there. And also, I didn't realize the positive role on refugees, for example. Those are encouraging signs. And I think those signs are probably available in hundreds of places around the world, Chris. And I think the challenge I would suggest is to tap them, to bring them together a little. See if we can't get a We Too movement, or whatever we call it, to bring some of those positive, locally important views together to really try and fight for the system. Because I'm afraid if we lose it, we're not going to get it back.
Dennis, you've always brought a real positive aspect to all of this incredibly challenging work, certainly with me and certainly hearing your remarks. So thank you so much for joining us again, Dennis. We really appreciate it. It's nighttime there in Geneva. It's daytime here in Missoula. And thanks again to the participants. I just want to remind you that tomorrow we have another and final episode celebrating the International Day of Peace. We have a colleague from the U.S. Institute of Peace, Sarhang Hamamsaid, who is going to talk to us about local initiatives in peace building. So looking not at the large international efforts, but looking at efforts that take place at the local level on peace building. It promises to be a fascinating show and an excellent way to wrap up this week with our good friends and partners at USIP. Let me thank again our sponsors, Stockman Bank, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, and Allegiance for helping us bring these kinds of shows to you. If you like this, or if you have other ideas, drop me a line. Come to our website. You see it right over my shoulder. All of these programs are also available on our YouTube channel. Simply Google Montana World Affairs Council, and you'll see Dennis and everybody else who's been on the show, whom we very much appreciate. So thank you again to Dennis. Thank you to our sponsors, and thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.